Well, welcome back to another SG Connect. Tonight's SG Connect is going to be a continuation of you might see it on the screen from time to time, of the book by book series that, Lord willing, I'll be doing over the next few years. And tonight's is the first book of the Bible. So tonight's book by book is the book of Genesis. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, you can go back and see the one that is a survey of the first 5 books of the Bible. But the basic goal is to help you get some things to get your mind around in each book of the Bible that will help you read and understand the Bible, and more than anything, get to know the God of the Bible, who is the primary author of the Bible, in a greater way. That's my prayer for this series. So let me pray. Lord, thank you that you made the heaven and earth out of nothing. Only you could do that. And I thank you that you love us, and we see your love displayed in every book of the Bible. I pray for anybody watching or everyone watching that one of the effects of this short survey would be a greater love and excitement for your word. For anyone who's just struggling to read your Bible, I pray something would click as we go through the book of Genesis, and ask for your help. Ask this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So think of these little book by book overviews as, if you're in a woods, in a forest, and you don't know where to go, and then you see some paths. So hopefully, what I'm going to show you is a few paths that are going to be through the book of Genesis that you can walk through and think, okay, if it's getting confusing or the details are getting a little obscure, okay, there's the path. Oh, I know where I am. I know where I am in the big storyline of the Bible. So this is the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. It was authored by Moses. And the book of Genesis is one that I think can often be looked at in the wrong ways. For example, this isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not the original intention. A lot of times you'll think of, or you hear about Genesis, particularly the first few chapters, as being examined much more as a science book than as a book of theology that's telling us all about the Lord. So you'll get into debates about the age of the earth. You'll get into debates about what does yom mean, the Hebrew word for day. Is it a literal 24 hours, or is it a larger span of time? So if that kind of stuff is of interest to you, I think that's great. It can be fascinating. But we're not going to talk about that today, because we're going to talk about what really is the big idea and purpose of the book of Genesis, which is really to know the God of the Bible and the God of all creation. So if you have a Bible, you have your phone, look at Genesis chapter 1. We'll look at 2 verses there. The first is Genesis 1:1, which says this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." God made the heavens and the earth, and he made them out of nothing, out of absolutely nothing, just by speaking. So some of you watching are very creative. You have lots of talents and gifts. So maybe you're good in the kitchen. Maybe you're good at baking or cooking a delicious dinner. Or maybe you have carpentry skills and you can build very ornate furniture. Maybe you can build a house. Maybe you're a gardener and you just have a green thumb and you keep up with it all year. You till the garden, you weed the garden, you fertilize the garden, and then in the fall or late summer, you have this wonderful garden filled with food. Well, all of those things, or maybe you're a painter and you can take just a few colors and make these beautiful paintings. Well, all those things are wonderful and they reflect God as creator. But what none of you can do, myself included, is create with nothing. You can't bake a pie without ingredients. You can't build a house without materials. You can't paint a picture without paint. I think you get the point. Only God can make something out of nothing by speaking. And or really the pinnacle of God's creation after he made everything, was mankind, was Adam and Eve. And so we learn in the book of Genesis that Adam and Eve were a unique part of creation, created as male and female to reflect God and his image. Let me read Genesis 1:26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over livestock, over all the earth, over the creeping things that creep on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So we, as human beings, have value and worth because we are created in the image of God. That is a unique description that's not given to any other animal that God made, any other part of creation. It's only human beings that are made to reflect the image of God. The fancy Latin word for that is the Imago Dei, that we are created in the image of God. So no matter what human being you interact with, I think it's good to remember that this person in its original intent was made to reflect the image of God. They are an image bearer of the Lord. Well, in Genesis, it starts out really strong. And if we were watching it in a movie or listening to it, we would hear birds singing. We would just hear pleasant music. If we were watching it, the sun would be shining. Everybody would be smiling. Adam and Eve would be enjoying each other's company. They would be spending time with the Lord himself in perfect unity and fellowship. And that lasts for the first 2 chapters of the Bible. And then the dark clouds would come in, the lightning probably would thunder, the eerie minor key music would be playing, and Satan himself, in the form of a snake, enters the Garden of Eden and tempts Adam and Eve to sin, and they eventually sin and rebel. And in Genesis 3, we see the consequences of that sin. We see God will eventually kick Adam and Eve out of his presence, out of the Garden of Eden. And that really sets the scene for the entire Bible. Because really the entire Bible after Genesis 3 is this unfolding of how will God rescue a people for himself, relate to human beings who have sinned against him and rebelled. How will he show mercy and be just at the same time as he's going to display his holiness? How will all God's attributes work in tension with one another? And how will God fulfill his ultimate plan to have a people for himself? Well, that whole stage is set in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, and then unfolds in the entire Bible. And we know that Jesus is the culmination of the solution to that problem of God's holiness and our sinfulness. We get a hint in Genesis 3:15. So if we're in the woods, we're in Genesis, and we're like, where's the path that we need to walk on? Well, one of the key markers is going to be Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And this is one of those verses you might read and you might think, oh, I didn't know that was a key marker. So I'll explain it. So Genesis 3:15, God's dealing out the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin and some of the things that they're going to experience. And this is what he says in verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman. That's like a mutual opposition. And between your offspring and her offspring, he, this is the key part of the verse, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. So Genesis 3:15 by theologians throughout time has been described or been called the proto-evangelion, which means the first gospel, the first hope of good news, that eventually there's going to be an offspring that is going to deliver and to rescue. This offspring is going to bruise Satan's heel or Satan's head, and this offspring will be bruised by Satan himself. Satan himself will strike at the offspring, but ultimately the offspring will be victorious. And theologians understand this description as Jesus who will come. Jesus will die, but by his death he will rise again and bring new life and bring salvation and bring permanent, ultimate reconciliation between sinful people and a holy God. All that's in Genesis 1 through 3. But then the story unfolds further. Excuse me. In Genesis 7 through 9, humans grow. So numerically, one of God's commands to Adam and Eve was be fruitful and multiply. And so over time, the people multiply and they grow in great numbers. But the problem is they all inherited Adam and Eve's sin. And so God eventually looks at all of humanity and he sees them in their rebellion and their hatred of him, their creator and maker, and their evil towards one another. We even learn really early in the book of Genesis that Cain kills his brother Abel. And so you may have never thought about it this way, but Adam and Eve were the parents of a murdered child and the parents of a murderer. And so it really set the stage for all the heartache and pain and suffering that people in our day and age experience, that parents experience in the sins of their children even. So we get to Genesis 7, the tension is building. God calls Noah and his family and says, build an ark. I'm going to flood the earth. And I think what's tricky about the flood account is in our day and age, the edge has been really taken off of it. So you think of maybe Noah's Ark Fisher-Price toys or Hallmark cards about Noah's Ark or little stuffed animal things, pictures of arks and animals, and none of those things are wrong. So if you have any of those, I think we had some of those. They're not wrong, but they don't just really capture the reality of what happened during the flood account. And what happened was all of humanity, with the exception of Noah and his family, were judged for their sin and rebellion. And so God, the just judge, rightly poured out wrath in the form of a flood. And everybody died except for Noah and his family. And so we see there this clear picture of the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin snowballing into the future. And yet we see God is both just, sinful mankind was punished. God is merciful, sinful mankind was preserved in Noah and his family. And so Adam and Eve were the recipients of God's covenant with them in Genesis 1 through 3. Then God makes another covenant, another binding promise that he initiates with Noah and his family. And part of the covenant in Genesis 9 is God promises he will never flood the earth again. And he has kept that promise. And the sign of the covenant of the covenant with Noah is that when you look into the sky and see a rainbow is to be the sign of God's covenant that he will never flood the earth again. And so next time you see a rainbow, think of God's justice and God's mercy. So that's the path we're on so far. So we got Genesis 1, 2, God makes a covenant with Adam and Eve. Genesis 3, the fall happens. Genesis 3:15, we get a hint of the good news that will eventually come way off in the distance. Then we have the covenant with Noah. And then a new person enters the scene, and his name is Abram, and he eventually becomes known as Abraham. And in Genesis 12, 1 through 2, and then in 15 and 17, we get the unfolding of what is known as the Abrahamic covenant, where God makes this incredible binding promise with Abraham and his descendants that they are to be a blessing. They're going to be blessed, and they're going to be a blessing. So let's take a look at that. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So that all the families is really important. So God chooses Abram, not based on anything unique about Abram, just on God's sovereign, gracious choice. And then through Abram, he promises his descendants will be abundant, more numerous than the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the seashore. But not only that, his descendants will be made up of people from all the earth. We learn in Revelation, we get this scene of heaven of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so, as you're working your way through Genesis and Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch, you'll see it's very oriented around the Jewish people, God's chosen people. But it was always part of God's plan to include a far greater number of people than just the Jewish people. And so we know that in Genesis 12, long before the Ten Commandments, long before the giving of the law, God intended for God's people to be made up of every tribe, tongue, and nation, which is an incredible thing. And so the Abrahamic covenant, this promise that you see in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, is a path that will keep showing up throughout the rest of the Bible. And Jesus himself is a fulfillment of that promise. And he's a fulfillment of a number of promises in the Bible, but particularly he's the one who makes a way for people for every tribe, tongue, and nation to be part of God's family, which is incredible. So a couple application points just as we're thinking about the book of Genesis in just this big overview survey kind of way. One of the connections I want us to make is when you read the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament is the same God that's in the New Testament. Sometimes people get confused about that. And the Bible primarily is about God, not about people. It's about people secondarily, meaning that God has always devised a way, had a plan for us as his image bearers to have a relationship with him. In Ephesians chapter 1, we see in the New Testament, Paul writes about God's sovereign choosing of a people for himself. So it shows great continuity between the book of Genesis and the book of Ephesians. And 1 Peter 2, we get this incredible picture of the Gentiles being brought in to God's chosen people. And you might remember the verse that starts like this: once you were not a people, but now you're God's people. Once you were far off, now you're brought in to the family. See, that started in the book of Genesis, and it culminated in Jesus. And one of the kind of the last applications of the promises of the book of Genesis, and as you read it, you'll see the unfolding of it over and over again, that no matter what obstacle comes, no matter what God's people do, no matter what sins are committed, God's plans cannot be thwarted. Probably the most classic example of that is when Joseph he's the little brother. God has spoken to him. He tells his family about it. They think he's arrogant and obnoxious and an annoying little brother, so much so that they decide to leave him for dead. He eventually gets sold as a slave in Egypt. And all these promises that were made earlier in the book of Genesis look like they're not going to happen. That God's people are kind of falling apart, and they're unraveling at the seams. They're unraveling in their behavior. And yet, we learn in the book of Genesis, near the end of the book, that God actually allowed and used the sins of Joseph's brother to preserve the entire nation of Israel in the future, because famine would come and there would be starvation, mass starvation, and so God actually sent Joseph ahead of his family and preserved him. So Joseph was in jail. He was wrongly accused of crimes he did not commit. He was forgotten. And all the while, he continued to pursue his covenant keeping God. And eventually, he rises to second in command in all of Egypt. And Joseph's entire family and brothers who had betrayed him come and they reunite. And there's this beautiful culminating verse at the end of the book of Genesis where Joseph's brothers were afraid that he was going to maybe kill them or imprison them now that their father had died. And he said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And the nation of Israel grows and grows in Egypt to the point where we will learn in the book of Exodus that when God leads his people, it's 1,000,000 strong. It's this huge group of people that God preserved all through the sins of Joseph's brothers. And so we can trust the Lord. He will keep his promises, he will be faithful. I hope you enjoy reading the book of Genesis this summer. Thanks for watching.